Escape to the metaverse. Better act like you know. Yeah. You are now tuned into the Matthew Rizzle show. Yeah. Escape to the metaverse. Better act like you know. Yeah. You are now tuned into the Matthew Rizzle show. Yeah. Escape to the metaverse. Better act like you know. You are now tuned into the Matthew Rizzle show. Yeah. Escape to the metaverse. Better act like you know. You are now tuned into the Matthew Rizzle show. Yeah.
Hey everyone, before we begin this week's episode of the Matthew and Rizzle Show, just want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Proof of Beauty. Proof of Beauty is an experimental digital experience studio. The blockchain is their canvas and the tokens are their brush. You can learn more about Proof of Beauty by checking out pob.studio. You can follow them on Twitter as well at PRRF Beauty. That's PRRF Beauty on Twitter and pob.studio on their homepage to learn more about their projects like Hash, London, and Publico. Thank you and enjoy the show.
Okay, Bryce, welcome to the Matthew Rizzle Show.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
Yeah, really excited to get into Mega Runners and everything that you're building out there. But to get started, I think it'd be great for our audience if you could introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, and then introduce all of us to Mega Runner.
Yeah, of course. My name is Bryce Anderson. I am traditionally a film and TV producer. I've been working in Hollywood since 2011. I started my career at United Talent Agency, which is one of the major talent agencies out here in LA. And then I went to Warner Brothers, where I was in the creative group for about 2 years. I worked on movies like Mad Max and Lego Batman and The Meg, a couple other things from the WB slate. And then in 2015, I went and I joined a brand new company called Clubhouse Pictures, where I still work, working for a guy named Brian Unclis, who is starting a brand new company. I was one of the first two employees there. And, Brian had created and produced The Hunger Games while he was working over at Color Force. And as that fourth movie was on its way out, he, decided to go set up shop and, put his name on the door. And I joined him at Clubhouse Pictures. And we went and we made a movie called Bright with Will Smith at Netflix. We made I, Tonya with Margot Robbie. We also did Birds of Prey for DC and Warner Brothers, Project Power with Jamie Foxx, among, several other movies. And then kind of on a parallel track, I started trading crypto in about 2013, and got pretty early into NFTs, bought, Bored Apes kind of the day they dropped. And that really kind of opened my mind as to what was possible in the Web3 space and how people were kind of orienting themselves and organizing themselves on the internet. And that really led us to Omega Runners, which is this project that we're working on right now, which is sort of, we call it Media3. And it's a blend of both worlds. It's like, how do you take a Web3 property? How do you build a Web3 property that is designed for success at a global scale? So it's, not just a profile picture collection, not just a Web3 property or collectible property, but also a narrative property that can then go translate into, feature film projects and gaming projects and merchandising projects and all these things at the highest level, so that the people that are fans of this project can interact with it with a lot of different ways, but also so that people can interact with it in a lot of different ways, but also that it can have this sort of life beyond beyond Web3 and beyond the community of Web3, which is really, really cool and powerful, but also very small.
Dude, love to hear it. And similarly interested in what Matt's talking about. Also, we got a lurker in the background, Nick from the team, who's supposed to beat up on Bryce if he stumbles over words or everything. So, if you got to unmute Nick and just let out a whack or something every now and again, it's all right. We work that into the podcast or just edit it out.
You got this, Bryce.
Sorry. Yeah, no, It's funny. It's been 2 weeks since I've given the stump speech, and
It's an interesting angle on things, but so I'm, as Matt is too, man, deep into like Web3. Help me understand like the context of like Media3 and how all that works together. And also, dude, would just love to hear like the elevator pitch, like on the project. We all have difficulty explaining whatever we do in like a few sentences. So
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So I think just to jump into Media3 first, when we talk about Media3, we kind of coined this term because we were looking at NFT projects and Web3 projects. And I think, if you go back to like early 2021, summer 2021, everyone was talking about how their project can go be the next Marvel, go be the next Disney, going to go be the next Hello Kitty. It was like, this project's getting a movie deal, this project's getting a TV deal, it's all going to work. But as somebody who's like, the last 10 years of my life has been dedicated to finding movies, right? Like that's what we do, is we take movies from nothingness into existence. And so a huge piece of that is knowing what properties are going to work as like feature film or television productions. And I think something that we ran into as we were looking at all these Media3 projects was we were like, there's a lot of really cool art here from like a collectible standpoint, from a culture standpoint, from like a streetwear standpoint, but there's not a lot of like deeper narrative that has the legs to go be, the Star Wars of the future. Like there's a lot of narrative work that has to go into that, to making something that functions on a larger kind of like world building level. And when we got into building a project of our own, which is Omega Runners, we started looking at other mediums where things could work. Because obviously a movie is an incredibly expensive way to launch a project, right? It's $100 million. It's 3 years of work, which is an eternity in the NFT space. There's a lot of compounding factors that make that a really, really difficult way to launch an NFT project. But there are things like comic books that are faster. And then there are things like, online gaming and even like small flash games and like competitions that are faster. And all of this stuff that we're building is still contributing to an underlying piece of IP. So what you're doing is you're building story. You are building story in, the most organic sense, but instead of dedicating yourself to a single medium, instead of saying what I am making is one movie, or what I am making is one comic book, or what I am making is one game, what you're really doing is you're building this thing in this multi-prong approach where I am building an online community and I am building the building blocks of like an entire entertainment world. And I am building a specific comic book that has like a beginning and a middle and an end and one, very narrow storyline. And I am doing all of this stuff within the context of a single project. And so for us, that was the idea of Media3. It was like, what does it look like to create a brand in this multifaceted online world, which is different from how it's been done traditionally in Hollywood, but also traditionally on the internet. It's like taking the skills of what we know about good storytelling and long-term storytelling and franchise creation in the traditional media world and applying those things to Web3. And I think, that's really the basis of what we call Media3. In terms of Runner specifically, so Runner started out as an idea we were developing in like early 2020. This is even before I knew what NFTs were. We had this idea we were talking about just as a story. But it was like we weren't sure what it was. It was like maybe it's a TV show, maybe it's a movie. But let's just keep kind of like building around this kernel of an idea. And then it happened pretty early on in the process that we started thinking about Web3 projects and how what a good successful Web3 project would look like, and we realized that Runner fit all of these criteria and was kind of like a great option. And so we built it out in that direction to succeed in that space. And at its core, Runner is a big idea world building story project. So it is set on the planet of Omega, and the planet of Omega evolved so that instead of settling conflict through war and a warrior culture, they evolved with a racing culture. So conflict was settled through speed and competition. And what that looks like is on a grander scale, once every 3 years, the entire planet gets together And every country on the planet of Omega nominates a couple of people that they call proxy runners, right? And these are called runners because back in the day it was running across a field. And then as technology advanced and evolved, these races became, much more high tech, much more vehicle based. And every nation on the planet nominates one proxy runner or a couple of proxy runners. And those people go and they compete in this 21-day, multi-stage race that goes all the way around the planet. And the winner of the race gets to nominate the sovereign of the world. So it becomes this kind of like big gonzo, anime Game of Thrones. As for the vision for the project, the rollout is a little different from standard NFT projects. What we're actually doing is we're starting with a comic book. We started selling our first edition of the comic book a couple weeks ago. We sold 1,000 of them really quickly. We're going to sell another tranche of a few more upcoming probably in the next few weeks. But the comic book is actually a physical comic book shipped to your door. It comes with a mint pass for the eventual PFP project. Our early adopters also got something we call a Genesis token or a first edition token, which will have added benefits long term. And the idea is that there's this story that we're putting out into the world with this comic book. And then there's this PFP collection that you can obviously mint into, which will give you a character, not from the comic, but a character of the world. So this character will have a nation, and this character will have their own traits, and this character will be their own person. We actually developed this face swapping system. So within the NFTs, there's like several 100,000 combinations of faces. So there should be, no specific overlaps between characters. You should get these really unique characters. For every holder, we are granting the IP rights to these holders. And then simultaneously, we are working on the storyline within the comic book ourselves and, hopefully within adaptations and things in the future. And so while we are working on that, we're really hoping that other people kind of buy into this collection and are taking the IP rights to these characters that they've created and they go and run with it and build their own things. And that those things can exist in parallel or exist as a fan community or then, at some point be folded into the main primary narrative that we're building as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the last part is what's really kind of got my imagination going. And I mean, this whole elevated, innovative approach that you're pursuing with Runner, it's really, really, it's next level. And it's taking like the ingredients that I think a lot of the early PFP / NFT projects have kind of uncovered and like shown as like potential ingredients in bigger projects, and you're really running with it, like no pun intended. So I'm just curious if you can kind of go into I mean, no one knows what's going to happen once you get into the PFP side of things and you go into like the subsequent chapters of the story and things like that. But like, what sort of interaction do you see or do you hope collectors will exhibit after they get their hands on the PFPs and get into kind of like helping mold the story? I'm curious about that part, that interactive element with the collectors and the overarching narrative.
Well, what's interesting is that that's one of the biggest sort of question marks as to how this works is we hope people come back and really engage with it. I think one of the things that inspires me and has inspired me for a long time is fan fiction and online fandom communities, even if it's like, big dumb moments where the internet came together. I don't know if you guys were around for like Twitch Plays Pokemon. And the sort of experiments in like collective storytelling that kind of exploded out of that. I think there's a world for a lot of different approaches. You can look at that. You can look at fan fiction. I have developed over the time a really deep respect and love of the fan fiction world. I think there's projects that we can look at that have approached this from a more kind of official way. If you look at like Jenkins of LA, really successful, great model that I would encourage other.
Is it just me? Did
Yep.
Mike
crapped out for a sec there.
I heard a funny little bleep, so sorry about that.
No,
I don't know where you lost me. I look at like Jenkins of LA, which is a really successful model, and obviously something that we hope to encourage. It's like, how do you build an ecosystem that encourages that kind of involvement? At the same time, being aware that what we're doing is we're building a story, yes, but we're also building a brand, right? And so I think one of the things that's so exciting about successful projects that have opened up the IP in the past, I use Apes, which is a community that I'm pretty deeply involved in, as kind of a benchmark for a lot of these things. But it's like, look, there's a record deal, and there's a coffee company, and there's a fast food restaurant, and like all of these things that can exist around a narrative project. And I think the goal with Runner was to build something that exists not just within the Web3 space, but then can actually go and with this collective brand building at some point jump from the Web3 space. I'll obviously always be based in Web3, but with Web3, there's 100,000 collectors, and in the world of television, like if you don't get 500,000 viewers a week, you're canceled, right? So there's a huge gulf to jump to go into the mainstream. And I think, how do you approach a project like this, knowing that you're building a brand in Web3, knowing that you're building something Web3 native that is for Web3 people, and at the same time recognizing that for the long-term success, not only do you need to bring more people into Web3, but you also need to allow people to engage with a project in a way that they don't necessarily need to know what crypto is, right? Like, can they engage with it just as a piece of entertainment the way they would engage with anything else that's on a streamer? And when they do that, does that create more fans that then drive value back to the NFT? Or when people go and create a YouTube show based on their characters, does that drive value back into the NFT? And then you end up in this world where you're creating the brand collectively, and you have 5,000 people within a collection that are all working towards, monetizing their own effort together as this multifaceted project. And I think that's where Web3 for me becomes really, really interesting.
This is something like I've actually given a lot of thought to lately as well, man, because I think we're seeing like a lot of projects, Apes included, Cyber Brokers is one of them as well, that are like really diving deep into like sort of like lore and like, user collector participation. And I wonder often, man, because I'm on like one side of the spectrum, and I don't think there's like a right side of the spectrum, but in terms of like user participation, I'm like pretty much a straight up collector. Like I like a lot of these projects that involve like another layer of participation, but I'm not like their target audience in terms of like attracting a collector who's also going to be like an active participant in their project. I'm more of like a fan who just wants to like hold a piece of like certain things or whatever. So being this deep into runners, I'm interested to hear your take on like where the overlap is between like collectors and like active participants, and sort of like, maybe one step deeper what you're talking about. Like, how do you bridge that gap of like, you got like a limited amount of owners like actually holding a thing, but you're trying to bring in like a mainstream audience that doesn't really have like a vested interest in that, piece of ownership, and maybe they don't care, but yeah, would love to hear like just your general thoughts about like these different communities and, attempting to merge them.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I would say, what you're looking at with those other properties, with those other projects, is they're kind of looking at this long-term wall where it's like, how do we evolve to exist within the media landscape as something like Power Rangers, or something like, I talk a lot about like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Pokemon. How do you go and become a property that has the ability to sink into, the kind of the broader popular culture and not just Web3 popular culture? And, I think that's something where it's like, one, you invite people to contribute. And when people want to contribute, I think that's something that's really cool about Web3, is it allows people to get involved in that way if they want to. Of course, you don't require them to. I think as a collector, simply, collecting and holding is a great form of participation. Collecting, holding, and then consuming some of these things that are made by the community. If you become like a more vested, curator or consumer, that's obviously a really good way to participate. And then the thing that makes Runner different is that we were built from the beginning to be a viable media property on our own. You know, we talk about this a lot, and I think this is something that sets us apart from a lot of the people in the Web3 space, especially people that are attempting to go make movies or television, which is that, you know, we have a TV deal, or we have a movie deal at Netflix, right? We have a full-time contract with them. We've done several movies there. We've done movies at Warner Brothers. You know, Brian's obviously done movies at Lionsgate. We've done two TV shows at Hulu. Like, we can go to any of these places and set up a project and fund a project, which is very different from, I think, the way a lot of people approach Media3 that look at Web3 as a financing base, more like a Kickstarter. And what we do differently with our project is, what we really want is we want that participation, and we want that sort of vocal fan community and that dedicated fan community. Because once we have that fan community, we can go to any of these places to go finance larger projects, and protect our project, and, you know, retain the rights ourselves and retain the rights for the community. And I think, have a much more fruitful kind of like long-term prospect.
Yeah, I think that intentionality is another key differentiator between a lot of the other projects out there. I mean, the big project that comes to mind in the Web3 space that's sort of becoming a media property would be, like, of course, like Bored Apes, right? But they sort of like accidentally stumbled into that, in my kind of view of things, versus this more intentional approach from the beginning with Runner, if I can say that. So that's, I'm just wondering if you can kind of double click into like the concept of a traditional media property, like everything that goes into that. I know you mentioned like there's different types of media deals, things like that, but kind of just for the uninitiated, like really pulling back the lid on that and talking about everything that entails, and for a new project, like everything that goes into that.
Yeah, everything that goes into that, and how that is similar but also different in Web3, and what Web3 does that's so exciting. So to give you a rundown a little bit of what our normal everyday job is we work in what's called, you know, movie producing, but also development. And I would say 80% of our job is spent in development. And development is, you know, taking ideas from nothingness, like truly just from the ether, and turning them into a script. Sometimes a script with a director attached, or a script with a writer and a director and a movie star attached. You know, getting the script into the right shape, making sure the idea is correct, then taking that and selling it to a studio. So we go and we sell it to Netflix or Warner's or Disney or whoever. And in that moment, when you sell it to a studio, they buy you out entirely. They buy your entire back end, and they give you, you know, a fee. And then you're in the studio system, and you're at the whims of the studio as to when they want to make something. And maybe they turn around and they say, oh, we can't make this because we don't have XYZ movie star. Oh, we can't make this because there's something similar that we're already making. Or we can't make this because we've already slated our 10 movies for this year, but maybe you'll have a better shot next year, right? Like, you end up into that cycle. And at some point, you convince them to actually put the money forward. They go, they make the movie. They make this movie, you know, you go and you spend 6 months on set making the movie, you turn the thing in, and then they go through and it's their release system. And movies, more than anything else, are a distribution platform. And what they'll do is they'll go and, you know, the traditional model will put them in theaters all over the world. Netflix will go and they'll do a day and date release, worldwide streaming. They will do a marketing plan that suits their medium most, whether it's theaters or online. And then if you're lucky and if you're a hit, they will start thinking about things like merchandising. They will start thinking about things like video game tie-ins. They will start thinking about like franchise potential beyond, you know, the world of their initial property. But what they're doing is, in all cases, they're starting with a movie, which is one of the most expensive pieces of media speculation you can ever do. And so as a producer, in order to get that shot, one, there's not a lot of shots. And two, the shots are, you know, they come with a lot of strings and you lose a lot of control. And I think something that's so exciting about Media3 is that we can take everything we know about building these high level properties, which are, have to be really buttoned up. And you can take that same approach, but then you can go and instead of playing in the $300 million, budget plus marketing spend release sandbox, you can play in the Web3 sandbox, which is so much more grassroots. And the feedback is immediate and you can pivot immediately. You can get, direct interaction between your creators and your consumers on things like Discord and Twitter, community spaces, things that we host. And what you can do is you can really kind of figure out what's resonating with this project and what people love about it. And then you can direct your intentions towards building out a media brand that serves that community first. So that can be things like comic books. That can be things like online meetups and competitions. That can be things like, eventually call it television or gaming or movies. But what you're doing is you're starting from this like fandom creation, brand creation space. And I think that's a really kind of new and novel and different approach. And what it allows creators to do is it allows them to retain the creative control and maintain more autonomy within the entertainment ecosystem. And what it gives fans is it gives them something new, right? People talk all the time about how they're getting the same sequels and they're getting the same, rehashed media properties from these major studios. And the reason for it is because these things are so expensive that nobody wants to take a $300 million risk on something untested. And yet, if you don't spend the $300 million, you're not going to compete in that landscape. And the way to do it is to build yourself an audience first. And if you build the audience first, you can go and you can start making new projects again and new media again. And I think I talk about this a lot, which is that every time there's kind of a major shift in how people consume media, whether it's the internet or, Saturday morning cartoons or radio, television, whatever, you see this shift in, you see this suddenly the window opens for like new, what we might call like landmark properties, right? A new property opens up. Like there's a gap in the market where something like call it Bored Apes can move in and become, the blue chip project of that medium. And I think in the world of NFTs right now, like that door has just barely opened, and there's space for something to come in and really establish itself as like the blockbuster of NFTs. And what I mean is like the blockbuster movie. So the Star Wars of NFTs, right? Which really invented like summer movie season, right? The Jaws of NFTs. And I think there's a real opportunity for that to happen, and it will happen in the next couple of years.
Dude, I love the like sort of inverse, like top down or bottom up or whatever direction we're going, sort of like turning the whole like, previous model on its head angle on this whole thing. So sort of like along those lines, like turning the business model on its head, like very interested, like this like leads into like a lot of like interesting territory with like copyright and IP, and like really interested to hear what your thoughts are on like how this affects some of these giants like Netflix on a long enough continuum. And if this is like, a complete disruption, if there's room enough for everybody or how this all shakes out. So, what are your thoughts?
Well, there's a lot of questions inside of that, but I think just to jump onto the Netflix thing, I think if we look at the entertainment industry for a long time, this actually happened in the 1940s. There was an antitrust case against the studios that said the studios can't control movie theaters. They have to be owned separately. And the reason that came in is, Warner Brothers had their theaters and MGM had their theaters and Universal had their theaters, and they were they were only showing their own movies. So they were preventing competition from coming in. And what you see with streaming is actually a reconsolidation of that old system where Netflix is only showing Netflix movies, where they're the producer and the distributor, right? And Hulu is the producer and the distributor. And I think when I think about NFTs and media creation, there's maybe a world where people come up with like a Web3 distribution model. But I think the distribution model is actually much, much harder to build than the production model. And I look at something like Netflix, I look at stuff like the traditional media system, and I say, these things are still very useful as a distribution system. I am very happy to make movies, make projects for them and use them as our distribution channel because they have hundreds of millions of users all around the world. And I think that's a really kind of useful place for NFTs to be able to go. And that means like, you just have to think about them a little bit differently rather than going to them right away with a bare bones idea and 4 creative partners and say, this is what we're going to do. You go to them with your idea and 4 creative partners and a comic book and a successful NFT project and 5,000 fans who are vocal and creating things and have built their own, corner of the internet. And you go to a place with a collection like that and you say, look at the impact I'm currently having on pop culture. Now will you make my movie? And here are my demands. And it gives you so much more leverage in that place to make a deal that is just worlds away better than the deal you would get without that sort of like community participation. You don't get stuck in the development cycle and you don't get stuck in this world where you have to give away the IP and you don't get stuck waiting for the success of the project before you figure out whether or not you're going to approach merchandising or gaming or other ancillary channels. And so that's how I think about Netflix. Your other question was talking about IP. And I think that's the side of innovation that, people are not talking about quite as much as they should, which is that, decentralized ownership, something like, a DAO ownership, but also, look at what Bored Apes did with like distributing the IP rights of their images, which is, we're going to do something very similar with this project. There's no really good mechanism within American copyright law to make that happen. There are ways that you kind of figure it out. But there has not been a real court case yet to really establish what the bounds of the laws that do exist are. And the laws that do exist really did not envision something like collective creation or collective ownership of a property, or collective distribution of specific rights within a property. And that's something that we've spent a lot of time working on. Obviously, being in the entertainment industry, we are very concerned with things like IP rights, because, that's our full business. And at the same time, recognizing that like the paradigm that the entertainment industry currently works under when it comes to IP rights is often more restrictive and less, and the world that Web3 wants to inhabit and wants to embrace, I think is a better world, but it's really talking with figuring out what the laws are like as a country, for these things to really kind of work and flourish. And there is actually some work being done in the Senate. They've actually just ordered this happened about a month ago. A couple of senators ordered a report basically on NFT ownership and as it relates to IP rights and copyright, which will be really, really interesting to see what they come up with there. But it is very much just like a Wild West at the moment.
Yeah, definitely feel like with quote unquote like NFT licenses and things like that, definitely feels very Wild West and very like rose tinted glasses. There's a lot of optimism or like utopian thinking like, hey, the NFT will solve all like IP issues and ownership rights and things like that. But like Bored Ape Yacht Club, for the innovation that they've done there, it's interesting to see like this fringe case erupt between Bored Apes owners and then like Ryder Ripps and what he's been doing with his like performance art project, minting the same exact images and trying to show Bored Ape Yacht Club owners that, hey, the rights that you thought you had aren't really like that or something like that. So
no, I actually think Ryder Ripps, I think Ryder Ripps is a slam dunk copyright violation suit. I don't actually think that's going to be very difficult to prove, because he just took the exact same art and copied it. I think the place where it becomes more interesting is when you look at, obviously as an ape owner, you own the image of your ape, but you don't own the words Bored Ape Yacht Club, and you don't own sort of like the collective Yuga branding, which is, a yacht club in the swamp in Florida. and, some of those things. And what happens when you build out a more in-depth storyline that is obviously more essential to the character. And then you give people the rights to these characters. But then when you give them the rights to the characters, obviously you're going to want to give them the rights to some of that storyline, some of that collective storyline that this character exists with it. And so you are giving a certain type of sort of these like ephemeral rights. And at the same time, you don't want to create a world where someone can come along and just, pirate the book you've created or pirate something that someone in your community has created and sell it for their own monetary gain, right? So you have to retain a certain amount of protection so that you can protect not only your own work, but also the work of the people in your community. Because if you're going to ask people to come in and contribute, they're going to want to know that if they can contribute, that their own work is not going to be used in a way that they don't want their work to be used. And I think, that's a really funny line to balance. And then when you go to create something at, one of these major studios, there's going to be a review of what's called chain of title, which is who owns what, just to make sure that, Universal isn't going to wind up with a copyright suit on their doorstep. And they're going to go through and they're going to really kick the tires. This is a very thorough investigation and it happens on every single movie, just as like a matter of course, about who created what part of the idea at what time, what was based on a book, what was based on something else, what was, the addition of this writer versus the addition of that writer versus something that the actor came up with on set. Like all of that stuff kind of goes into a very long, thorough legal document so that there's an understanding from the moment of its creation, who owns the underlying IP rights to that project. And that is a process that we have yet to see an NFT collection go through. And I think is something that if you're not ready for it, if you're not set up for it from the beginning, could be a very kind of difficult and could be a major wrench in getting something translated to call it a franchise level, AAA level piece of media entertainment.
So in the context of runners, how are you thinking about the ownership rights for folks that will eventually get the PFPs and, is that public, or are you still kind of noodling on that, taking your time before the PFP is released? Curious about.
We're still noodling on it, and I don't want to sit here and say this is what it's going to be, because this is why we have good lawyers. But just from an ethos perspective, the idea is that we have this 10,000 PFP collection, and that the holders of the PFP will have the rights to their own character. At the same time, the characters that we're running with inside of our comic book we have these 8 characters that we've kind of established as ourselves. We call them, community characters that will be retained by us as a company. And so the goal is that there becomes a blurring of the line between these community characters and these characters that are owned by the community. Sometimes the community characters maybe come in or the 10,000 PFP owned characters come in and will participate in this main storyline, or maybe even our community characters go and participate in their storylines, figuring out how that can work. But I think as a way to set it up initially, we've delineated it that way. And the reason that you do that is because copyright law is, not enforced by the state. Copyright law is enforced by the copyright holder. And so some of it comes down to what is it that we retain ourselves, and what do we defend ourselves? And at what point do we end up defending, our own holders if something goes awry? And what kind of agreement do we make with them? And a lot of it comes down to a trust kind of based thing between us and them, because at the end of the day, it's what you enforce and what you can enforce. So you set up yourself in a way that you can enforce as much as you need to. And then you kind of go into this promise and with this intention that, this is how we are going to enforce our own copyright. And that's how you make your own rules with your own projects. But this is where it gets really fuzzy in this, there's no specific legal mechanism to do this in the United States.
Dude, like you said, the Wild West, man, fascinating to see how it's all going to sort of shake out on a, long enough timeline, and genuinely appreciate anyone who's, sort of pushing the boundaries and poking around in uncharted territory. Dude, one of the things we love to ask our guests is to sort of do like an intrusive shakedown of your wallet, and are just genuinely interested in what people are collecting, or what other projects our guests are interested in that don't necessarily have anything to do with their project at all, just as like a NFT fan collector type of thing. So you mentioned apes and a couple other projects, but what else is out there that catches your eye or you're interested in these days?
Well, there's a lot of cool stuff kind of going on in what we might call the Film 3 world. There's this project called Fringe Drifters I'm really into. It's created by these dudes up in Portland, or Seattle, maybe. I think it's Seattle, one of those Pacific Northwest cities. And
you have to get the city right. You can't do
I'm sorry.
Seattle will kill you if it's Seattle. Portland will kill you if it's Portland.
I'm pretty sure it's Seattle. And they are approaching this kind of in a very similar way to how we're approaching it, maybe a little bit more on the indie side, but a sort of a similar approach to character and story and kind of like long-term vision. I love cyber brokers. I think there's a lot of real potential in Azuki and the story building that they've put into that so far. I think there's a lot of like long-term legs there. There's a lot of things that I've been interested in. If you just like look at my wallet, stuff that I've collected that is sort of like early. I always buy things that are doing stuff that's interesting. So, I bought, think about like, most of these things are underwater at this point, but like Stoner Cats, you got to give a nod to Stoner Cats as being one of the first kind of forays into like, how do we create media using Web3? There's a lot to learn when you look at how that project worked out. I think about Robotos and Pablo Stanley as somebody who I really love. Then recently, I've been much deeper into just like generative art. So it's honestly, my FX hash wallet is doing that. That's been where I've spent most of my time kind of in this bear market, is get away from the PFP projects a little bit. But I do think that there's a real, like, the beauty of the bear market is that the people that stick around are the people that really believe in this, and the projects that we've seen, I think, are better in the last 3 months than we saw maybe 6 months ago. I think that the quality is really, people have had to step up their game. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting things going on over there. But those are the things that I'm looking at right now.
Definitely shout out Tezos and FX Hash. They've taken a ton of my time and attention and money too. It's so fun collecting over there. It really, it's like a throwback to the early days on Ethereum, when like back in super rare things were selling like now blue chip, quote unquote blue chip artists are selling for like less than $100. Kind of going around collecting whatever you want, get that same vibe. Amazing artists over on like Object and FX Hash for sure.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because it's like, I think we get lost in this thing where the last year of NFTs have been so crazy, and looking at like 6-figure valuations on things has been so insane. Like I am not a person who can buy $100,000 NFT, right? Like that, I'm not prepared to do that really. But I own a couple, but I bought them all under $1,000, right? Like, yep. And just realizing that like, so much of this was just kind of like poking around on the internet, seeing things that were cool, seeing people that were doing things that were new. There's this collection called Proof of Beauty that I love. And he's just this artist who just uses code as art, right? And he's just doing new things with blockchain. He did this project called Public Piano that was like a 64 NFT collection where whoever owned the 0 token got to decide what everybody else's NFT was, right? Like just really simple things like that.
Fun fact: sponsors Matthew Rizzle show.
Really? I didn't.
History on the blockchain. Yeah.
I love that work. And actually, one of the original things they created was with with London, which is one of their things. So they made this changer which allowed you to go through and you could take any like major PFP collection and then you could switch out the background for the London that you owned. So you could actually put two NFTs together into a single image just on their website. And they were sort of built as this like augment an NFT you already own with another NFT you already own sort of process. And I think that was actually something that, as we were, building out Runner, was a really, really early inspiration for something that we're doing a little bit more down the line. But I think there's a lot of innovation happening over there that I'm, really fascinated by.
100%. And like you alluded to a little bit earlier, you sold out the first tranche of the comics, right? Just curious if you want to hit people with some expected timelines for when you're going to reopen comic sales, maybe updated timeline for the PFP portion of the project, and any other important milestones or dates you want to let people know to look out for runners.
Yeah, of course. I don't have specific dates right now. What we did is we opened right before NFT NYC. We basically opened our early access list to 1,000 people, and those first 1,000 people will get a copy of the comic. They get a allow list spot for the PFP mint, and then they also get what we call our first edition token, which will be like an NFT that'll have some utility long term. But the next chance to get in will be sort of a similar process, call it part of the pre-sale, which is an allow list spot and a comic book shipped to your door for a really reasonable price. The first one was at $29. You get like a very beautifully illustrated comic book sent to your door. And that will be open again for the next tranche, hopefully in the next few weeks. Check out our Discord, Twitter, follow along. And then comic books themselves will go out to the people that already bought them within the next couple weeks. They're getting printed at the moment. And there's a worldwide paper shortage, so that took a little bit longer than expected, but it will all be there eventually. And then the PFP mint is going to happen probably later this summer, early fall. I don't want to commit too much because obviously, we all know how this market can work right now. But the art is, I would say, 95% of the way done. I'm putting some touches on a couple of elements still, but we're really excited about it. And it looks beautiful. We worked with this company. So we approached this whole creation of this whole project the way we would approach like a feature film. And so we have a director whose name is Cedric Nicholas Troya, and who's a feature film director. We worked with him on a movie called Kate in Thailand, which is this Netflix movie with Mary Elizabeth Winstead and Woody Harrelson. But prior to that, he was, he did one of the Snow White the Huntsman movies, and he was actually an Academy Award nominated VFX supervisor. And that was really where he cut his teeth for a long, long time. He's one of the best VFX artists in the world, but then his real kind of like foundation was in animation. And he has a deep love of anime. And, we brought him in to run the visual creation of this project. We brought in a guy named Blaise Hemingway, who's our screenwriter, who spent a lot of time over. He was in the story trust at Disney Animation, worked on Frozen, Zootopia, Big Hero 6, Wreck-It Ralph, did production rewrites on like Tron. As well as what he did recently. He did like Clifford the Big Red Dog, Vampires versus the Bronx, like a lot of really high level studio stuff. And that was sort of the story trust. And then we went out and we hired a wonderful animation house based out of Copenhagen called Sun Creature Studios. And Sun Creature actually just got nominated for 3 Academy Awards for their movie Flea this last year, which is this beautiful animated documentary. But they've done this incredible work. A lot of their artists were like, concept artists on Arcane, which I think is sort of that like Euro anime style that we're really, really into. And it's something that we're really kind of leaning into. And then we have our comic book team, and we have our sort of our brand building team and our tech team running simultaneously. So this is a very sort of a larger scale project, I think, than most kind of garage band NFT projects.
No, it's amazing to see the evolution, and it's amazing to see how projects are stepping their game up immensely. it's a sign that there's really fertile ground in this space, and you got to do more. You got to get bigger, and you can grow deep roots quicker with bigger teams. So it's awesome, man. I'm really excited to see this project evolve. Hopefully I can get into the next tranche for the comic book collection. I went up and try to like see if I could scoop anything in the pre-sale. I'm like, oh shit, it already sold out of that first round. So it's amazing to see. And then the PFP drop, excited for that. But just want to thank you, Bryce, for jumping on the show with Rizzle and myself, telling us all about runners, and keep doing, keep creating, man.
Thanks for having me. It's really great to talk to you guys.
Yeah, it's been awesome, man.
And thank you to Metaversal for setting this up.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to this week's episode. Just want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Proof of Beauty. Proof of Beauty is an experimental digital experience studio. The blockchain is their canvas, and the tokens are their brush. You can learn more about Proof of Beauty by checking out pob.studio. You can follow them on Twitter as well at PRRF Beauty. That's PRRF Beauty on Twitter, and pob.studio on their homepage to learn more about their projects like Hash, London, and Publico. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.